Oh. You.
Megan, we're ready on our side if you want to start us off.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to our first virtual program for California Biodiversity Week. My name is Megan Tobias, and I am an Environmental Education Associate with the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. Wildlife Society is a nonprofit friends group that supports the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, which was established to protect wildlife and conserve and restore essential habitats. California Biodiversity Day is today. September 7th is a day to celebrate our state's unique biodiversity and encourage actions to protect it. The Wildlife Society and Don Edwards SFA National Wildlife Refuge are hosting a week-long celebration. In addition to today's program, we are posting lots of content on our Facebook page, such as species highlights and fun self-guided activities. So please check us out at San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. We are also hosting 2 more virtual programs. Since you are all registered for the week-long event, you will be sent the Zoom links to join these 2 programs listed. And before we begin our program, I would like to start by recognizing that Don Edwards SFA National Wildlife Refuge sits on ancestral land of many bands of what we now call the Ohlone people. This land continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people and all descendants of the Chochenyo, Ramaytush, and Tamian language groups. We want to recognize the history of this land and recognize that the Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of our communities and the broader Bay Area communities today. If you know what Indigenous lands that you are joining us from, please feel free to type them into the chat and share them with us. And if you would like to learn more about the Indigenous lands that you live on, please visit native/land.org. For today's program, we will be using the chat feature. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we will do our best to answer them throughout the hike. We also have some time at the end for any additional questions. I'll now pass it over to our presenters, Rachel and Olivia. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks so much for joining. My name is Rachel Cooley. I'm an interpretive associate with the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society.
And my name is Olivia Polis. I am also an interpretive associate with the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. And we are going to be taking you on a virtual hike today, calling in live from the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. And we're going to be highlighting some of the incredible biodiversity that you can find here. Okay, and so just to give a quick kind of recap here, we are on a national wildlife refuge, which means it's going to be land that is set aside by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the protection of this habitat, the incredible species that we have here, and some of the amazing biodiversity that we're going to be able to show you today. As you can see, I'm in front of our entrance sign here at the Environmental Education Center in Alviso, and that is going to be one of our jumping off points today as we continue on. I'm also going to give a quick shout out to Miguel Marquez. If you want to introduce yourself really quickly, Miguel. He's going to be on the call with us today, available to answer any questions. He is our urban refuge ranger. You want to go ahead and
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here for California Biodiversity Week. Really excited to go on this virtual habitat hike with Rachel and Olivia. Thank you, Megan, for putting this on. And thanks for everyone for joining us. I am the Urban Refuge Ranger at Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, based out of Fremont and Alviso, California. Look forward to taking and introducing new visitors to the refuge and showing them all the recreational opportunities to be done at the refuge. Look forward to all of your questions. Thank you. Back to you, Olivia.
Thanks so much, Miguel. And like I said, Miguel is going to be on to answer questions for us and to just be available to be an amazing Urban Refuge Ranger resource that he is. And I'm going to give just a quick introduction to the creation of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service so that we have the understanding of what we're talking about when we're on this land here in Alviso, on Ohlone land. Just a quick update on, or just a quick recap on the history of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Some of you might recognize this guy in the photo here. That's Teddy Roosevelt. And he was the president who is credited with the creation of the first national wildlife refuge in Pelican Island, Florida. And it's all to do with this man in the photograph here you probably don't recognize, even though they do have very similar nice mustaches. This is a German immigrant named Paul Krogel, who was living out of Pelican Island in the early 1900s and noticed that a lot of the birds and the pelicans that he loved and enjoyed so much were actually being hunted almost to the brink of extinction. Back in the day, the fashion and hats at the time was to have these actual large plumes. It was fashionable for ladies' hats, and it caused a lot of poaching and hunting of these very rare bird species. And they were becoming increasingly low in population numbers. And so Paul stepped in and he wanted to stop this from happening. And that actually, his advocacy led to the creation of the first national wildlife refuge in Florida. And that leads us to our own local history here in the Bay Area and the creation of Don Edwards. Originally, it was just called the San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, and Don Edwards was added on to the end in 1995 in honor of Senator Don Edwards, who was integral in creating this refuge. And here's just a little intro into the amazing people that also were absolutely fundamental in creating this refuge. This right here is Florence Riviere. She and her citizens committee to complete the refuge were the everyday citizens that advocated for the protection of this land and are the reason that we get to enjoy this beautiful wildlife refuge. So as we continue on, keep thinking about those things that everyday citizens like you and me were able to protect this land for the birds and the incredible biodiversity that lives here. So we're going to continue walking on and get our tour started. Thanks, everyone. And so now we're going to be walking alongside the Environmental Education Center and heading out to the new Chicago Marsh. And the reason it's called New Chicago Marsh is actually kind of a funny story. There was a man named P.H. Wheeler, who was from Chicago, who originally tried to develop this land to build not only housing, but also a watch factory. He was a watchmaker. And in honor of that failed business venture, we do call this New Chicago Marsh today still.
So right now we're moving from the upland habitat down to our salt marsh. So you might see some differences between these two habitats.
Okay, we're just coming along the New Chicago Marsh Trail here. And we will be entering into the marsh. And as you can see, we are on a boardwalk. And this boardwalk was created so that we could be as close to the marsh as possible without causing any harm by stepping on any fragile plants and making sure that we protect that habitat for the bird and mice and other species that live here. And just like with any hike, Rachel and I prepared. We've got our sunscreen on, we've got water with us to make sure that we're protecting ourselves and staying safe. Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining me in the marsh. So we're now into the salt marsh habitat, and a habitat is just a home. It's like where you and I live, but this is the home of some of the many incredible species that we're going to be touching on a little bit today. That's going to be some amazing plant species, as well as some of our endangered species that we protect here on the refuge, as well as over 280 bird species. And that's one of the reasons why this area of land was so important. all wetland habitats are important. They're extremely biodiverse. They support a large number and variety of species, which is pretty incredible. But Don Edwards is also the stop, a very important stop on the Pacific Flyway. And you can think of the Pacific Flyway like an interstate highway for migrating bird species. They are going to need places to stop, rest, and refuel along the way. And this is one of the areas that they love to do that, especially some of our wintering bird species. As you know, we have pretty good weather all year round here in California, and a lot of the birds will love to come and hang out here during the winter where it's pretty mild, and they have all of this incredible land to enjoy that has the food that they need, the habitat that they need, and that they can rest and refuel, just like if you were on a road trip. So like I said, 280 bird species, and that's actually the number of different types of species, which is pretty amazing. And this is also a great area for humans to come. We have a lot of variety of recreation spots for hiking, biking, getting out on the trail. And we're also in a very urban area. Don Edwards is an urban national wildlife refuge. So you probably see behind me, this is the kind of the San Jose and Alviso skyline in the background. And we're also actually close to a lot of landfills, which is something that's just important to realize for how land evolves and changes over time. We have a giant landfill to the next of us. The Environmental Education Center was actually built on repurposed land that was originally a landfill. And those kinds of things will actually impact this, habitat and this environment for many years to come. So it's a good reminder about how we get rid of our waste, making sure that we're recycling so that we can continue to protect these landscapes. And just to give a final more shout out for the biodiversity of this area, there are so many species that you can come and see here. It's an amazing spot for bird watching, amazing spot for hopefully seeing some really incredible species that we're going to be talking about today. Okay, we're going to get flipped around here real quick so that we can start moving along on our hike here.
All right, so our next stop, I'm going to talk about the plants that we have in the salt marsh. You can see right now, not a lot of plant diversity going on in the salt marsh. Maybe you start thinking about why compared to where we started. You might have seen a lot of tall trees and shrubs, and compared to the salt marsh, we have very low-lying plants. So I'll talk about that in a second. Me and Olivia are just gonna continue walking down the boardwalk with you.
And you might also notice that even though a salt marsh is a wetland habitat, there actually isn't a ton of water on the section that we're at right now. And while most salt marshes are tidal, this is a non-tidal salt marsh because it is actually controlled by a water control structure that we have. And it's trying to, mimic different parts of the season, and especially we're just entering the end of breeding season for a lot of our bird species, and they don't need as much water. They need more nesting habitat. So we have altered the actual height of the water to make sure that they have enough nesting habitat.
Yes, and we also control the water in this salt marsh because you can see in the background, we have Alviso community right adjacent to the refuge. So if this was a tidal marsh, they would experience a lot of flooding. So that's another reason why we have to control the water in this portion.
And one of the reasons why we talk about biodiversity so much and celebrate it this week is that biodiversity is a great way for scientists and everyday, citizen scientists like us to get a good idea of how a habitat or how an ecosystem is doing. Is it healthy? Are there enough species? Are they being supported? Do they have enough food? And that kind of resilient habitat is going to be really important going forward with climate change, because we want to make sure that we have enough resilient habitats that provide us with ecosystem services and things like that. And some of the really important part of that habitat is going to be our plant life. So Rachel is going to take it away with that.
All right, everyone. So, I'm in the salt marsh. So we have two main plants that live in our salt marsh. And as I mentioned earlier, and as you can see, they're very low-lying, low plants. And the reason for that is because they are adapted to living in the salt marsh and adapted to living in salt water. Not a lot of plants like salt water. If your house plants had to consume salt water, they probably wouldn't do so well. But these plants have been here for a long time. They have special adaptations to survive in salt water. So the first plant I'm going to talk about is pickleweed. I'll get a sample. So this is pickleweed. You might notice it kind of looks like a succulent. Maybe you have a succulent at home, and it is actually in the same family. It is segmented, so it does look like little pickles, and it actually tastes like pickles. I don't advise you to eat pickleweed here. We'll leave it up to the animals to eat this pickleweed. But when we do have our school programs, we let the kiddos eat some of the pickleweed. It just tastes like a concentrated pickle, really. And the way that pickleweed gets rid of salt in salt water is that it will push the salt all the way to its tips. Those tips will turn an orange-red color, and then eventually those tips will fall off with all the concentrated salt. So that's how pickleweed gets rid of salt. You'll see right now in the summer that the pickleweed is about a brown color. Some of it has died off a bit, and that's normal with California plants. They have adapted to basically slowing down during the summer, turning brown, dropping their leaves because as you know, we don't have a lot of water in the summer. It gets really hot. So in the spring, you'll see pickleweed be more of this bright lime green color. And pickleweed is important food source and nesting habitat for one of our endangered species, which I'll talk about in our next step. So that's pickleweed. I'll go ahead and put that back. Our next plant is alkali heath. Alkali heath. Very pretty plant, also low to the ground. You might see a pretty little pink purple flower that blooms. And I'm trying to move it around so you might be able to see some salt crystals on this plant. And alkali heath gets rid of salt the same way that we do. So how do we get rid of salt? Maybe you're working out. So yeah, we sweat out salt. That's how humans get rid of salt, and that's how alkali heath gets rid of salt. It just sweats it out. You can see some of the salt crystals on the leaves. So that is our second plant that we have. Salt marsh. So in terms of biodiversity, not a lot of diversity in terms of plant species in the salt marsh, because as I said, plants don't really like salt water, but these plants provide very important nesting habitat for endangered species, but a lot of our migratory birds use this area to breed and to make families. While I'm here, I'll also point out the water that we have. So looking at this water, of course for us, it doesn't look very appealing to us. Not something we want to swim in, but this is actually good, healthy water for our plants and animals here. It's sort of this green, brownish color, and that's because there's a lot of phytoplankton, very small plants that are the base of our food chain here in the salt marsh. So I just wanted to point that out to you, trying to give you a good idea of what the salt marsh looks like today. All right, so we'll move on to our next stop, and we'll see some birds while we move on.
Yeah, it looks like we've got some nice bird species ahead of us that we'll be able to take a look at. So we are going to be coming upon some black-necked stilts, and we'll try to get close enough so that we're still going to be on the boardwalk, but hopefully you'll be able to see a few. These black-necked stilts are called that because you can actually see they are going to be black all down their back with a nice white front. They kind of look like they're wearing little tuxedos. And my favorite fun fact about the black-necked stilt is that they actually have the second longest leg to body ratio of any bird species in the world, second only to the flamingo. Hopefully you guys can see that clearly enough. Try to zoom in a little bit. I know it'll be pretty fuzzy, but at least you can see them kind of feeding on, there's lots of little mud creatures in there. Again, kind of like Rachel said, think about the bottom of the food chain, tiny little creatures that live in the mud that are some important food for the black-necked stilt and a lot of our other wading shorebirds.
The black-necked stilt actually used to be one of our migratory species, but they loved it so much in California because we have mild weather and good food supply that they decide to stay at the refuge all year round. Kind of like a lot of us who move to California or visit, we kind of want to stay here for a longer period of time.
And we'll just pause to look in the mud a little bit. Hopefully it's not too blurry for you all. But if you see some little black creatures moving around, one of the very popular food sources for a lot of different birds are actually brine flies. And they're called that because they enjoy spending time in salt water. And they'll usually just kind of hang out right on the edge of the water, which is why you'll see a lot of the bird species focusing on those outer edges where the water is really shallow, and they can get lots of little bugs as well.
And sometimes when you visit the refuge, you might notice that it smells like rotting eggs. Luckily today, it does not smell like rotting eggs. And some people think, oh, why does it smell that way? And it's actually because there are a lot of small plants in the water and a bunch of creatures that are decomposing things, and they let off that gas. So it's not us that smells bad. It's just the cycle of life. Things are decomposing. And as Olivia mentioned before, we are next to landfill, so that contributes to the smell. But luckily we have a good wind today, so we're not smelling that today.
And you will see some different colored algae in the water. Algae is also a very important food source for some of those little water invertebrates and species, like the water boatman is one of my favorite. We had a species highlight go out on our Facebook page, which you can check out there for some more information about the water boatman. He's a cute little insect who our bird species love feeding on, and he loves feeding on the algae, just to kind of give you a good idea of that food chain. Okay, so we're coming up to one of our interpretive signs about the black-necked stilt, which we got to hopefully see a little bit in person. And then I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite bird species that we have here on the refuge. I'm very excited to talk about them. Hopefully we'll be able to actually see some in the background. Now, one of my favorite species is the American white pelican. These are huge birds, and it's actually kind of amazing. I feel like every time I see them, I'm still surprised at how large they are. When you see them flying, even though they look all white on the outside, they actually have these really pretty black feathers underneath their wing, which is a good way to identify them when they're in flight. And hopefully you can see from this photo here. I like this photo because you can see it's got a little like growth on his beak or bill there, which is actually a way that you can also tell that it is the breeding season for the American white pelican. Both male and female birds will grow that during the breeding season. It's kind of like their little signal that they're single and ready to mingle. And then it will actually shed or fall off at the end. So it's kind of a cool way so you can tell where they're at in their life cycle as well. And my favorite thing about the American white pelican is that they actually have a best friend called the double-crested cormorant. And so we'll be able to see the salt pond in just a little bit where they're probably going to be hanging out. The American white pelican and the double-crested cormorant hang out together. They feed together. They will kind of gather in circles and kick up the water to get fish to kind of come in, and then all take turns feeding, and the cormorants will help them out together. They also have sleepovers. They hang out on some islands, and you'll be able to see that in a little bit too. I was hoping they're going to be out here. You should be able to see them pretty soon. So that is one of my favorites. And then now we're just going to talk about a little bit of the migratory birds that we're talking about, right? So 280 bird species, so many of those are going to be traveling throughout the year on that Pacific Flyway. And some of my favorite are the wintering ducks that we have. And this is going to be the mallard duck. You've probably recognized this in your local park or even in your backyard or any water sources in your neighborhood. And they are the most populous duck in North America. So we'll definitely see a lot of those. And this is going to be a dabbling duck. So we have two different kind of ways that we characterize how ducks feed. One is dabbling and one is diving. So diving are those ducks that you see actually going underneath the water. Most of them can hold their breath for about a minute. And then you have your dabbling duck species, which will hang out on the surface, get little creatures off of the surface of the water there. And so that will be that kind of dabbling duck. And a dabbling duck that is probably the most adapted to be able to do that super well is the northern shoveler. And you can actually see as that huge spatulate bill, which kind of sounds like spatula, uses it like a spoon, almost like a vacuum, almost to kind of get little creatures and other invertebrates off the top of the water. So he's adapted pretty well to that. And that's usually a pretty good symbol because not a lot of other of the duck species on the refuge have a beak that looks just like that. So it's a good way to kind of be able to identify them. And probably my favorite one is the pirate of the refuge, the gadwall duck. And this guy likes to eat all the little creatures that are down under the water in the mud, but he's a dabbling duck and not a diving duck. So what he'll actually do is wait for diving duck species to get down there in the mud, get the little creatures, bring them up, and then right as they're about to surface, he will come in like a little pirate and steal right from the other duck species, right from them. So he can get all those little creatures that he likes eating as well. So that's probably my favorite little pirate duck out plundering the marsh. So hopefully that gives you a good idea to some of the amazing bird species, specifically our wintering ducks that are hanging out here during the summer or during the winter that we will get to see, and hopefully give you some ideas about how to identify those species when you see them.
All right, we're gonna go to our next stop. Want you all to get a good view of the marsh. This is a great part where we're at for bird watching. So if you can visit us in person, please bring some binoculars and maybe a bird field guide to identify all the birds that we have. I myself am a new birder. I didn't really appreciate birds growing up, but now I know how important they are and how many they are too. So I try to get out and try to identify some birds when I'm walking around. And I'll just point out something really quick in the salt marsh, which fortunately gets here by the way of human action, but you see there's a little wrapper right there. So the refuge is situated in an area where we're kind of at the end of the watershed. So all the water that flows down from our cities enters storm drains and eventually empties out into our streams and creeks, which eventually end up emptying it out to the refuge. And so we try to make sure to tell people to pick up their trash, be more mindful when they're hiking out, to pack it in and pack it out, just so we don't have trash pollution that can be harmful for our plants and animals that live here. And what's cool about salt marshes too is they act as a sort of filter for pollutants. The plants and sediment are able to trap in chemical pollutants before they enter the bay. As we approach our next stop, we have a snowy egret in the distance. Try to zoom in once we get closer. And snowy egrets are very common at the refuge. There are shorebirds. You can see that in the distance. They're a shorebird. They use their long legs to walk through the water in the mud, and they have a very sharp, skinny beak to capture any fish and critters in the water. So maybe we can watch it for a moment, hunting. And I actually see the snowy egret in the same spot, I think, and I do a lot of programs. I think it's just, they took over this spot and this is where they come to get their lunch or dinner. He's kind of moving in slowly, trying to find some critters in the water. It looks like a white little dot right now, but hopefully they'll come here and get a closer view of our snow egret. So right now, I'm going to talk about the two endangered species that call the refuge home. So the first is the salt marsh harvest mouse that we affectionately call Salty. And unfortunately, Salty is nocturnal, so we won't be able to see Salty today. And just looking at Salty, you'll see that it has special characteristics, adaptations so that it could be out at night. You'll see in the picture it has these large eyes so you can see, and these cupped large ears so you can hear long distances. And Salty is endangered for many reasons. Endangered meaning their populations numbers are low and they are brink of extinction unless we help them out. And the main reason why Salty is endangered is because it's lost a lot of its habitat. So we've lost 80 to 90% of our marsh habitat in the Bay Area. So that's why salty numbers have gone down. Salty also only lives for 9 months. So it doesn't get a birthday, unfortunately. And that's not a lot of time to find someone special and make a family, right? Salty doesn't have dating apps like we do these days. So 9 months isn't really a long time to grow up and find someone in this vast landscape and make a family. So that's another reason why salty is endangered. Another cool thing about salty is it's one of the only mouse species that can survive in salt water. It has a special organ in its body to drink salt water, and that organ is able to separate the salt from the water. Salty can also swim, which is pretty cool. Not a lot of mice can swim. And it doesn't swim long distances. It only swims if it's getting away from a predator or if there's a high tide coming in. And salty is only the size of your thumb. So very, very small, very hard to see. And our scientists are monitoring salty by setting up traps during a time of the year at dusk. And then in the morning, they'll able to see if there's a mouse in the trap, and they take hair samples and they're able to see if this is a mouse they've seen before or a new mouse. So we're hoping that salty is taken off the endangered list soon as we provide more salt marsh habitat for them. So that's salty. Our next endangered species is the California ridgeways rail, called Cali for short. Cali is a shorebird. It has this nice sort of cinnamon, black, orange feathers. It's the size of a chicken, and it actually tastes like chicken. People, when they started to live around the marsh, they started to put Cali on dinner menus, and that's probably one of the first reasons why Cali numbers started to go down. But again, this animal is endangered because it's lost a lot of its home and its habitat in the salt marsh. So that's Cali, also nocturnal, so only comes out early morning dusk to feed and find food, but we usually don't see Cali during this time of the day. But if you are here at the refuge very early and you hear a noise, you might be lucky enough to see Cali. I myself haven't seen Cali before, but I hope to one day. So those are two endangered species, the California ridgeways rail and the salt marsh harvest mouse. And they're the main reasons why this refuge was established, to protect these endangered species and to make sure they survive, because they're endemic. So they're only found in the San Francisco Bay and nowhere else. And they're very important and integral to the salt marsh habitat. So we're gonna move on to our next stop.
So our next stop on our little tour here is going to be a former salt pond habitat. So as some of you may know, much of the southern San Francisco Bay was kind of altered throughout our recent history for salt production. So that's harvesting our salts from the bay for industrial processes like dyeing clothes or tanning leather, sometimes ice for roads as well. And while it's definitely a much lower percentage of that land area is still being used for salt production, we have been able to actually actually change those habitats to create them into salt ponds that will support the species that live there. One of the things that has been done is we've put some islands in for these birds to nest on, and it's mainly going to be those American white pelicans that I was talking about.
So these islands that you'll see in the distance, actually human-made, and they were made so that migratory birds can have somewhere to stop.
Hopefully you can hear some of those screeches, and most of those are going to be the American white pelican and a few of our other shorebirds.
So this is our salt pond habitat. And as Olivia was mentioning, this was formerly a salt pond to collect salt. And over time, our scientists and biologists have created a more natural habitat that's more alike to the salt marsh. And how they do that is they break down levees. So this long trail that you see is a levee, basically just mud and dirt piled on itself to enclose the water. So what they do is they breach the levee, they make a space between the levee, and they let water and sediment from the bay come into the salt pond. And over time, plants will establish themselves so that there's more of a natural habitat for our migratory birds and other animals. And that process takes a long time. It kind of depends, maybe 10 to 20 years for a salt pond to be reestablished as more of a salt marsh natural habitat. So we do have some islands here for our birds to land. And one of those birds that we're trying to attract is the Caspian tern. And the reason why we're trying to attract this bird to come here to this refuge is they're causing a lot of ruckus in the Pacific Northwest. What they're doing is they're flying up to Oregon and Washington, and they're eating a lot of the salmon species, a lot of the salmon. And that's causing problems because salmon is very important to the ecosystems up north. And so what we're trying to do is attract these birds to come here instead of flying up to Oregon. And we're doing that. We set up a little speaker on the island to call out the terns. And we have this nice island so they can come here and lay their eggs and not cause so much trouble in the Pacific Northwest. So that's kind of an interesting story that's part of the salt pond. And we're hoping to create more salt marsh habitats from salt ponds. This area is part of the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, which is a huge project, the largest on the West Coast to restore wetlands. And we're doing that for wildlife, but also for us, because we will need a lot of natural habitat and salt marshes to soak up water as we face climate change and sea level rise. So it's very important for us to support that effort in organizations that are trying to create more natural habitat for us.
Perfect. It is beautiful up here. And we are going to take a little trip back down where it's a little bit less windy so that you can hear us, and we can definitely have a lot of time for some questions. It's probably one of my favorite spots here in the marsh. I'll flip around so you can see. It's pretty stunning over here. Rachel and I love being out here on the refuge to be able to see this. And it's also important that we protect this habitat. Like I said, we have the Citizens Committee to Complete the Refuge, who was the first group to advocate for the protection of this land. But there are also small things that we can do every day to make sure that we protect not only this habitat, but the other surrounding bay habitats and our watersheds. Watersheds are, if you think about all of the water draining down from our beautiful hills in the East Bay and in the South Bay, all of that water has to drain somewhere. So it's coming from our storm drains, it's coming through our creeks into the salt marsh and into the bay. And like Rachel mentioned, that salt marsh acts as a filter. So it's filtering out a lot of the pollutants that we have from oil from cars on the road, pieces of rubber from tires, litter that just is on the ground, pet waste even. So even though, you know, it's a beautiful place that we can all do something small to do to protect, whether that's picking up after ourselves with our trash, taking your car to the car wash instead of washing it in the street and letting that soap go into the storm drain. There are so many small things that we can all do to create a big impact together.
And our wetland habitat here is also beneficial for us. Our trails are open. Our visitor center and education center are still closed, but we welcome you to visit our trails, enjoy nature. I myself have been visiting our refuge in Fremont more, and it's been really helping me. I know it's been a very tough time for everyone, so we do encourage you to enjoy these spaces that are dedicated for wildlife, but also for us to enjoy for a long time.
Yes, and we hope you will continue to come to our virtual programming while we can and able to get out here on the trail for yourselves as well. And we do have plenty of time for questions. If there's anything else that you would like to know about this habitat, the species that live here, if you want to go ahead and put those in the chat, Megan will go ahead and read them out to us. Myself, Rachel, or Miguel can answer any of those. So just let us know if there's anything else you're interested in learning more about. hopefully you can still hear us well, Megan.
Yes, I can hear you well. And Miguel has his hand raised. So Miguel, if you'd like to say something, please go ahead.
Oh, that was, I thought that was a hand clap, but if it was a hand raise or a hand clap, they all look the same. But I want to thank Rachel and Olivia for this beautiful tour. I enjoyed this tour and I hope you all did the same. And what really stuck with me was how you all mentioned that the Bay Area is all connected, whether you live in Oakland, whether you live in Hayward, San Leandro, Union City. We do have a lot of connections to the Bay. A lot of the wildlife love their Bay. I know you all love your Bay. So it's all Bay love, and what you do in your backyard really affects the refuge. So thank you for everyone for being stewards, and thank you for loving our public lands.
Thanks, Miguel. Oh, thanks for being here, Michael.
Thanks everyone for being here on an early weekday. We really appreciate you making the time to be here. If you don't have any questions, or if you think of questions later on, you have our email through the event registration. You can email us there, and we hope to see you at our next 2 programs on Thursday and Friday.
Yes, and if you are interested in finding more out about any, stewardship rules that we have here on the refuge, we do have our own personal website for the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society, as well as the Don Edwards Refuge. And Megan can go ahead and put those links in the chat for you. And like Rachel said, email us if you have any questions.
And I do see one question from Michael. I'm not sure if you wanted to expand on any of those things at all, Rachel or Olivia or Miguel.
Yeah, I mean, if there are any questions about rules for visiting, we do have those available on those websites. We also have a few signs posted around the refuge, some interpretive signs and things like that to learn more if you are here just giving yourself a self-guided tour.
It's pretty much when you visit the refuge the same at any sort of park or outdoor space. Please stay on the trail, make sure you don't leave any trash behind, be mindful of the plants and wildlife. And an important thing too in the Bay Area, not to fly any drones. I know that we like to do our little gadgets and things in the Bay Area, but we leave the flying to the birds. So that's one rule we like to tell people too.
Yes, absolutely. And it's definitely important to be recreating responsibly while we're here. Now we have your masks and we can't be 6 feet away from everyone. Also, just with current heat conditions, it's super important to have enough water and snacks for your day out on the trail, and to be mindful of wildlife smoke as well, as we are getting into wildfire season.
Yes. And you can also bike here as well. So a lot of recreation opportunities at the refuge to enjoy.
Yes, we are connected to the Bay Trail, which is an excellent kind of thing that will actually take you through the refuge and connect you to a few other public lands in the Bay Area. And I see that Megan put the links in the chat for you. So any other questions for that as well, you can definitely check those links out. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We hope you learned a little bit something more about the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge today. As a reminder, we will have 2 more programs this week, and if you registered for any of them, you'll be getting those links an hour before those events take place, and we hope to see you there as well.
Everyone, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.